Have you ever wondered what happens when the highest court in the nation slams the brakes on a president's favorite economic weapon? Only for that president to turn around and signal he still has other rounds loaded and ready to fire? That's the moment the world woke up to on February 20th, 2026. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court struck down large portions of Donald Trump's sweeping global tariff regime. On the surface, it looked like a dramatic check on executive power, a constitutional guardrail, a sigh of relief for businesses that had been drowning in import taxes. But the reality? It's far more complicated and far less comforting. To understand why, you have to rewind to what defined much of Trump's second-term trade strategy: the aggressive use of presidential emergency powers. The administration invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1977 law originally written to deal with genuine national crises. Think freezing foreign assets, blocking financial transactions, responding to hostile regimes. What it was not designed for was rewriting America's entire tariff system. And yet, that's exactly what happened.
For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. But it is not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen. In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal. That means they do it to us and we do it to them.
On what the White House branded Liberation Day in April 2025, the administration rolled out sweeping reciprocal tariffs on imports from nearly every country. The message was simple and politically potent. America had been taken advantage of for decades, and this was payback. The tariffs, officials argued, would revive manufacturing, force trading partners into fairer deals, and raise revenue to offset tax cuts and chip away at the national debt. And they did raise revenue. A lot of it. Government figures showed more than $175 billion flowing in. Some estimates ran even higher. The average U.S. tariff rate, once hovering around 2.7%, shot up to as high as 15.4% before the court stepped in. For major trading partners like China, India, and several Southeast Asian economies, effective rates climbed into punishing double digits, stacked on top of existing duties. But here's the part that often gets lost in the political rhetoric. Tariffs aren't paid by foreign governments. They're paid by importers. And in most cases, those importers pass the costs along. Study after study, including research from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, found that roughly 90% of the burden fell on American companies and households. That meant higher prices on furniture, clothing, electronics, car parts, virtually everything that touches a global supply chain. Small businesses were hit especially hard, squeezed by sudden cost spikes and supply chain chaos they had little power to control. So when the Supreme Court ruled, many saw it as a turning point. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, made a clear point. When Congress gives a president tariff authority, it does so explicitly and with defined limits. The 1977 emergency law never mentioned tariffs. It was never intended to be a blank check for presidents to unilaterally rewrite the country's trade code under the banner of emergency. In other words, the court wasn't weighing in on whether tariffs were good or bad policy. It was saying something more fundamental. There are lines, and this crossed one. It was a rare and significant judicial pushback against one of the signature pillars of Trump's second-term agenda. But let's slow this down and really ask the question, what does this Supreme Court ruling actually mean in practice? Because on paper, it sounds technical. Legal authority invalidated. Statutory interpretation. Executive overreach. But in reality, this decision hits politics, prices, global trade, the federal budget, and the presidency itself. First, let's talk about the political impact. This was a major loss for the president. Not symbolic, not procedural, substantive. For years, Donald Trump built his economic identity around tariffs. He framed them as the engine of American revival, tools to bring manufacturing back home, shrink trade deficits, and generate massive revenue without raising domestic taxes. Tariffs weren't just policy, they were philosophy, they were leverage, they were proof, in his view, that America could win again. And then the Supreme Court pulled the rug out from under the legal foundation that supported much of that strategy.
What makes it even more striking is who joined the majority. Two justices Trump appointed during his first term, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch, voted against the administration. That detail matters because it undercuts the narrative that a conservative court automatically protects a conservative president. This wasn't a narrow technical rebuke. It was a clear message. Presidential power has limits. Which brings us to the second point. This decision demonstrated the court's independence. In recent years, the Supreme Court had issued a series of rulings that aligned with the administration's priorities on immigration enforcement, agency structure, regulatory authority. Many critics argued the court was ideologically sympathetic. But this case was different. This was the first time in Trump's second term that the court issued a final merits decision squarely rejecting a major executive action. And the majority wasn't just liberal justices, it was cross-ideological. That matters institutionally. It sends a signal that even a conservative-leaning court will not rubber stamp every assertion of executive power. For constitutional scholars, that's significant. For the White House, it's a constraint. Now, what about consumers? Here's where expectations collide with reality. You might assume that striking down tariffs would immediately lower prices, that if duties disappear, goods become cheaper. But the real-world effect is likely to be modest, at best. Why? Because businesses had already adapted. When tariffs were imposed, companies adjusted supply chains. They shifted sourcing. They raised prices. They renegotiated contracts. Some absorbed costs, many passed them on. Those adjustments are sticky. They don't unwind overnight. And almost immediately after the ruling, new tariffs were announced under different legal authority. So there's little reason to expect a wave of price cuts at your local store. The system recalibrates, but it doesn't reset. Now zoom out globally. From Ottawa to Brussels to New Delhi, the reaction wasn't celebration. It was caution. Governments and business leaders understood something important. The court eliminated one legal tool, not the entire trade strategy. The administration still has multiple statutory levers available. So instead of popping champagne, trade ministries started analyzing contingency plans. Canada, the European Union, India, Southeast Asia. They were all asking the same question: what replaces the invalidated duties? And how does that affect the deals we just negotiated? Which leads to the budget. Tariffs had quietly become a serious revenue stream. The Congressional Budget Office projected roughly $3 trillion in tariff-related revenue over the next decade under the pre-ruling structure. That's not pocket change. By knocking out roughly half of that projected intake, the ruling potentially created a $1 trillion hole in future federal revenue, unless alternative tariffs fill the gap quickly. And in Washington, a $1 trillion hole is not abstract. It affects deficit projections. It affects spending debates. It affects fiscal negotiations on Capitol Hill. But perhaps the most legally complex and administratively daunting issue is refunds. More than $175 billion in duties had already been collected. Thousands of importers filed lawsuits seeking repayment, and the Supreme Court offered no roadmap for what happens next. No instructions on eligibility, no clear refund formula, no timeline. The matter now returns to the Court of International Trade, and what awaits there is administrative chaos. Here's why. When goods enter the United States, importers typically post bonds and pay estimated duties up front. Final liquidation, essentially the official calculation, happens within about a year. If companies overpaid, they get refunds. If they underpaid, they owe more. But now the underlying authority for many of those duties has been invalidated, so lower courts must determine whether finalized assessments can be reopened, whether refunds include interest, whether claims apply retroactively. There are already over 1,800 tariff-related suits on file. Experts expect a flood of new litigation. Sorting through millions of transactions across thousands of companies will be extraordinarily complicated. Some importers, anticipating years of legal limbo, have already sold their potential refund claims to investors at steep discounts, taking immediate cash rather than waiting for uncertain recoveries that could stretch for years. For small businesses, the legal costs alone may be prohibitive. Even successful claimants could wait years to see repayment.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. What a shame. Having to do with voting in particular, when in fact they're just being fools and lapdogs for the rhinos and the radical left Democrats.
Now consider the president's reaction. It was not restrained. He described the ruling as deeply disappointing and ridiculous. He expressed shame toward the six-justice majority, including his own nominees. He called them fools, lapdogs, unpatriotic, disloyal to the Constitution. And he rejected the premise that the court had meaningfully constrained him, because in his view, alternative legal pathways exist, and he moved quickly to prove that point. Before the ruling even landed, many countries had negotiated bilateral arrangements to soften the impact of the highest tariffs. These weren't minor side deals. They were sweeping agreements involving investment pledges, energy purchases, and sector-specific carve-outs. The European Union had agreed to a 15% cap and committed to massive purchases of American energy and hundreds of billions in new investments. Lawmakers in the European Parliament were preparing ratification steps. Britain secured what it called a privileged baseline tariff position with carve-outs for steel and autos. India saw duties drop from 50% to 18% in exchange for a pledge to buy $500 billion of American goods over 5 years. Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia each settled around 19% after facing threats of much steeper levies. China navigated a complex structure. Some emergency-based duties were stripped away by the ruling, but Section 232 national security tariffs and Section 301 unfair trade practice duties on electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum remained intact. And then came the twist.
But other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones that the court incorrectly rejected. Could be more money. We'll take in more money. Therefore, effective immediately, all national security tariffs under Section 232 and existing Section 301 tariffs remain in place and in full force and effect. Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And we're also initiating several Section 301 and other investigations to protect our country from unfair trading practices of other countries and companies.
Hours after the Supreme Court decision, the president signed a new executive order. A 10% global tariff on imports from all countries. But just a day later, Trump escalated, raising that global rate to 15% and doubling down on his pledge to keep his tariff strategy aggressive, no matter the legal or political headwinds. The legal basis? Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a rarely discussed provision never before invoked in this way. It allows temporary surcharges of up to 15% to address large balance of payments deficits. There's a 150-day limit unless Congress extends it, but the president brushed aside questions about that constraint, asserting broad authority to act. He also confirmed that existing Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs remain fully in force. And additional Section 301 investigations were launched targeting specific products and countries. In other words, the toolbox is still very much open. The speed of the president's pivot changed everything. Within hours of the court striking down the old tariff framework, a new one was in place. And that's where the real uncertainty began, not just in Washington, but in boardrooms across the world. Because imagine you're a global manufacturer. You've just spent months, maybe years, reworking supply chains, renegotiating contracts, shifting sourcing from one country to another. You've adjusted prices. You've explained those increases to investors. You've built your 2026 forecasts around a specific tariff regime. And then suddenly, that regime collapses. But instead of clarity, you get another one layered on top, using a different statute, with different timelines, different legal risks, and potentially different rates down the road. Analysts from banks, trade associations, and policy think tanks were quick to warn. Replacing one tariff structure with another, especially under less tested legal authorities, doesn't stabilize the system. It prolongs the confusion. Companies now face a maze of new questions. What rates will ultimately stick? How long will the new tariffs last? Will Congress extend them? Will courts strike them down too? Are refunds coming? And if they do, when? It's like the scaffolding of the old building has collapsed, but the building itself is still under construction. Nobody knows what the final structure will look like. And this uncertainty doesn't stop with businesses. It spills directly into monetary policy. Just recently, officials at the Federal Reserve had started to express cautious optimism. Tariff-driven inflation pressures appeared to be stabilizing. Supply chains were adapting. Price spikes were moderating. Then the Supreme Court ruling hit. On paper, invalidating tariffs could ease inflation. But in practice, the immediate replacement with new duties and the possibility of billions in refunds created a whole new layer of unpredictability. Would businesses suddenly receive large repayments? Would that cash injection distort balance sheets? Would companies revert to pre-tariff sourcing models or wait out more legal fights? How long will litigation over refunds drag on? Interest rate futures markets reacted almost instantly. Traders swung between expectations of rate cuts in June or July, trying to price in a reality that had just become far more complicated. Federal Reserve presidents acknowledged the problem publicly. Switching from one tariff authority to another doesn't just shift tax policy, it creates transitional uncertainty. And uncertainty affects investment. It affects hiring. It affects pricing decisions made by CEOs across the country. Now, let's be clear about one thing. This does not mean tariffs are disappearing. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated plainly that the administration intends to use alternative authorities to ensure tariff revenue remains virtually unchanged in 2026. In other words, the fiscal strategy tied to tariffs is not being abandoned, and legal experts are already pointing to other tools sitting quietly in the statute books. Section 338 of the 1930 Tariff Act, for example, could theoretically allow even more aggressive unilateral trade action. It's rarely invoked. It hasn't been tested in modern courts, but it exists, which means the story isn't tariffs are gone. The story is the battlefield has shifted. In the end, the Supreme Court's decision did reassert constitutional boundaries. It blocked one particularly expansive use of emergency powers. That matters institutionally. It reinforces that even broad executive authority has limits. But it did not end the era of high unilateral tariffs. Instead, it opened a new chapter, one defined by unpredictability. Global trade partners are recalculating. American businesses are revising forecasts again. Consumers are watching prices that may not fall. Federal Reserve policymakers are adjusting models that just stabilized. For many who hoped the ruling would deliver clarity, or relief, the outcome feels different. The fight over tariffs didn't end with the ruling. It simply moved to a new arena.